As long as you think of your skill set as being transferable, there's no value in thinking I'm a specialist on this. If your approach to it is to think, well, I'm a historian who can explore a range of things, not just what I'm interested in, but what needs to be researched at that particular point in time. If you've got a sense that your abilities are transferable, you can take them in lots of directions.
So I'm particularly interested in how we might take what's important about journalism and redesign it for technology. So that means that I'm interested in design methods and the development of technology, in particular interaction design, which is about the intersection of people and technology. So as a former journalist, that's interesting to me because design is a practice and journalism is a practice, and it makes me think about how I take what's important about this one practice over here, combine it with this other practice over here, and we get something new in the middle.
Religion within the academies, certainly in the Anglophone tradition, has been primarily about explaining religion by explaining it away, and never recognising it, therefore, as a phenomenon important in its own right. And so the battle for studies in religion has always been, on the one hand, to try to distinguish itself from theology and divinity, to try to say that in spite of your beliefs to the contrary, we're not actually covert Christians trying to bring you to the Lord. And on the other hand, to persuade those in the social sciences and in the history disciplines in particular that actually to explain religion is not to explain it away, and it's not just epiphenomenal to something else, that it really is important in its own right. If you want to understand what it is to be human, don't explain away religion, work on explaining it, because it can't be explained away in simple social scientific or historical terms. It's important in its own right.
So archaeologists are employed either by state or local governments in heritage regulation, or they're employed by government departments that move a lot of earth. So the biggest employers in Queensland are the Department of Main Roads, Queensland Rail, companies that are changing the landscape and have to do heritage work as part of that, or mining companies doing open cut mining, for instance, or BHP, Rio Tinto, companies like that, or intercultural heritage consultancy companies. And there are numerous companies that are just cultural heritage consultancy companies, and there are a large number of large multinational sort of, environmental engineering companies that are doing the environmental impact assessments as part of developments. They either have their own in-house cultural heritage professionals, many of which are archaeologists, or they subcontract out the work to these heritage consultancy companies.
Many of the students who start off in criminology have a dream of becoming a CSI expert. And so I think there are maybe two kinds of students. Students who kind of get interested in other things and realize there's, I'm talking about the students who stay in criminology and decide that they want to kind of go off into another area, because it's a very kind of rich tapestry of what they could get into. And then I think you have the other kinds of students who, this has been a lifelong passion for these people, and these people probably end up in policing. So, and the thing about policing is that you can either kind of come in the non-civilian route and become a police officer, kind of a line officer, when you're first hired, and work up through the ranks. Or there are various kind of civilian type positions where people can come in as researchers or other roles like that.
So this is something that has come up a lot in this course that I've been teaching this semester, is this tension between practice and theory, and in gender studies. So the course was gender studies and cultures and races. So that was kind of the theme, and so we were touching on different topics each week, doing sometimes some really kind of theoretical, philosophical stuff. So ideas of racialized time and queer temporalities. That's really kind of abstracted high theory in a sense, but at the same time it's talking about real concrete issues. So this is a tension, and I think that the importance is that we keep having those conversations, and the tension will always be there. So my role as an academic in the university then is to engage with these students, and not all of these students are going to continue on and become academics. They're going to go and work in NGOs, they're going to go and work in government, but they've now got this background in theory that then becomes used practically in the world.
I think often people point to that saying, oh, but you know, the student makeup is like 80% female, 20% males, especially in humanities and stuff like that. I'm like, that fact actually annoys me more, because then why are we only being taught by men? Like, because it shows that there's definitely a barrier that's stopping all of these women. Like the gender makeup of it totally flips the higher you get up the ladder. But I guess I didn't notice a huge amount of women compared to men in my classes or anything like that. I still notice it a bit now in history, that there's many more men in the history department than there are women.
Well, there have been times when, working in a research environment mainly comprised of intellectual historians, which is often a male-dominated field, there have been times when I've been the only woman in the work unit that I work in, and then you feel so tired constantly having to bring up the lack of diversity in the workplace, and it becomes something that becomes applied in your own workplace. But that too is something that changes. The work environment that I'm in now would be closer to 40% women, I think. And so the transformation of that, in terms of your day-to-day practice, I think the fact that there are other female faces around the table, there are other people to raise issues that need to be raised in terms of how gendered positions impacts on a workplace. That kind of labour that falls on women to be pleasant, to absorb other people's rudeness and anger, and to always smile and cheerfully go on about things, and to do it both up the kind of managerial hierarchy across with your peers and to the cohort of students that you have, is incredibly fatiguing. And so that's one of the things that I think that you're most mindful of if you happen to be the only woman in a particular work unit, and you notice your life become easier if you're working in a more diverse workplace.
I don't know. I was just talking to a senior woman colleague, and she was talking about, we were talking about structural impediments and women's promotion in academia, but not just academia. She was saying, she's doing some courses which are making her think about how, yes, there are structural impediments, but then there are also the impediments that people put into their own head, which stop them from imagining themselves into those spaces. And so I think, I've always been really conscious of being a bit of a representative, because there are not as many women as men in academia from the minute you get appointed as a level A beginning academic upwards, and it gets fewer and fewer as you go higher and higher. And so I've always been conscious that I need to kind of both, I suppose, honour the people who've helped me to get there, and some of those have been seeing me as a student seeing women who are succeeding, and some of those have been me having male mentors as well. And so I don't think it's black and white, but I think particularly when I was a student, in the department that I was working, literature department, which in Australia often means you do have quite a lot of women academics, and that department that trained me hit gender parity when I was in the last years of my PhD, and it was a cause for celebration and by the women academics, and that was a really great moment. But those women didn't have children. None of them had children, and the men had children, but we never saw them. Or every now and again we'd see them and we'd think, oh, isn't that nice? But I remember, thinking that, yeah, I did want to have a child at some stage, but just not seeing anybody mapping that for me. And for me, it was when I was a master's student and PhD student, and I was doing some tutoring at another university, which was in the same town, but probably wasn't as prestigious. And there was a woman who was at that stage an associate professor, and she had 2 children. And I remember going to her, she would talk about her kids. I would drop off material to her at her home, and she was out in the garden with her husband and 2 kids. And there were meetings we had in which she had a sick kid who had to sit in the corner because mum had to come into work that day. And I was like, oh, really? You don't have to choose. And so that's why I like to keep my private life private, relatively, but I talk about the fact that I have a kid, and I talk about the fact that I work the way I do because I have a kid, and that's not the main thing that people need to know about me, but I think it's really important for young women and young men who these days really do want to be involved in raising their own children to see that it's possible to do. Yes, it's hard, it's complicated, it's a juggle, but if that's a juggle you want to make, it's possible to do it. And to be successful, that needs to be accounted for.
It's a good question whether the university is a diverse place. I would have to say no, it's not diverse. It's at least more accessible, much more accessible in Australia than it is in the United States. But the truth, even in Australia, where tuition costs are relatively low compared to the US, where they're astronomical, but the truth is universities are going to reflect inequality in a broader society. So the university will be perfectly diverse and representative when equality itself has been achieved socially. So that's a far off goal, but until you have racial and gender equality in Australian society, you're not going to have those things in universities.